Well, I can start out with the subtitle, The Secrets of the Unified Field, and the subtitle is The Philadelphia Experiment, the Nazi Bell, and the Discarded Theory. And if you read the history of physics, Einstein's unified field theories, and he actually wrote several of them, they were all discarded because, like all the other unified field theories put out at that time in the 20s and 30s, because all they were attempting to unify were gravitation and electromagnetism. And to a theoretical physicist, this is an incomplete theory because there's two more forces, namely the strong and weak nuclear forces within quantum mechanics. So these unified field theories weren't true grand unified field theories in the modern physics sense. But that said, we have to go back to what was happening in 1920s and 30s Germany, and that's a very significant place, obviously, given the subtitle of the book, because Germany was really kind of a field of ferment for unified physics, and the first unified field theory was actually published in 1921 by a German mathematician by the name of Kaluza. And Einstein so liked the theory, liked the idea behind the theory, because what Kaluza did was he simply took Einstein's general relativity and Maxwell's equations of electromagnetism and unified them. But to do so, and here's a key point, he had to do it in 5 dimensions, okay? 4 spatial dimensions and 1 time dimension. Well, Einstein liked the idea so much he began playing around with similar ideas, and of course he published his first real kind of fully thought out unified field theory in 1928. And when he did so, and this is going to be a key component in our discussions tonight probably, is he incorporated a mathematical expression called the torsion tensor. Now, for your listeners and your chat room listeners, what torsion is, the analogy I like to use to illustrate it for people, is if they take an aluminum soda can, and if they empty the soda out of it, and then wring the can like a dish rag, okay, what the can will do is it will spiral, and then it will fold and crinkle and pleat, and the ends of the can draw closer together. So what torsion does to space-time itself is it spirals it and folds and pleats it, just like the aluminum can. Now, in most cases, this is a very minute effect, and it certainly was in Einstein's unified field theory. But here's the key, Jeremiah. In 1935, and I go through this history at much greater length, of course, in the book.
Yes.
But in 1935, a Hungarian electrical engineering genius, and he really was a genius, by the name of Gabriel Kron, K-R-O-N, published a paper which won him the Montefiore Prize from the University of Liège in Belgium. And what he said in the paper was that certain things that most electrical engineers who deal with rotating electrical systems and networked electrical systems notice, the slight phase creep, the anomalous gains of energy, and so on and so forth, that these could only be explained in terms of some version of Einstein's higher dimensional unified field theory that incorporated torsion. Now, that may seem like a rather ridiculous thing to say unless you consider the implications of what he's saying and when he's saying it. The implications are, of course, that if you can say that about electrical systems, then what you've really said is that you can engineer space-time on the laboratory bench with common electrical circuits. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
That's kind of a breath taker, but that's exactly what he's really saying. Now, of course, given the fact that he won this prize at the University of Liège in Belgium, it was a very prestigious prize, as a matter of fact, and given the fact that he wins it in 1935, just across the border over there in Germany, of course, you've got some very bad people watching all of this.
Right, yeah.
And, Kron eventually makes his way to the United States and publishes papers of a similar nature throughout his entire career with General Electric. So in other words, this man is bringing all of these unified field theories from the abstractions of theoretical physics into the electrical engineer's bench. And this is the key. Because what he's also saying is these aren't just highbrow, mathematical theories with hieroglyphics of differential equations on blackboards. These things, he says, while they may be incomplete as physics theories, they are engineerable theories. And it's, to me, very peculiar, Jeremiah, that right about this time in Nazi Germany, publication on unified field theories ceases. Now, the common physics explanation is, well, they were incomplete theories and they were dead ends and nothing further could be done with them. But, there's Krone's paper saying quite the opposite. So my belief is that the Nazi government probably put a clamp of classification on publication of those types of papers in the scientific journals, because that physics became the basis not only in Nazi Germany, in my opinion, for the Bell Project, but it became the basis, of course, over here in the United States for the Philadelphia experiment, because Allende, in his letters about the experiment, states very clearly that the experiment was based on Einstein's unified field theory. Well, the only one that's practically engineerable in that historical context is precisely this 28 version that Einstein published in that early paper. And it's that version that Krone was talking about when he said this is an electrically engineerable theory. Well, engineerable is exactly what it means. In other words, you can take common, ordinary equipment, like electrical coils or Tesla coils, pardon me, and construct a circuit in such a way that you're going to get anomalous creeps. You're going to get gatings of energy into the circuit that really are not explainable in any other way than that the circuit creates by virtue of its geometrical parameters, creates some sort of gateway and allows energy to cascade into the circuit from higher dimensions, quite literally. And the way that this is done is via the mechanism of torsion. In other words, all electrical systems, to a certain extent, are rotating systems, some much more than others, obviously. But anytime you start a rotating system in motion, be it the sun or the planets or small electrical circuits or gyroscopes or what have you, you're also opening up a kind of a gateway into this torsion effect that exists in space-time. So you're connecting very directly, if you will, with the medium of space-time itself. So that's what I mean by engineerable. I'm not saying that it's easy by any stretch of the imagination,
right.
Because if you look at these two experiments in particular, they're very they're very complex and complicated things, and they
in his book.
Right. Well, Jessup enters the story early on in the actual story of the Philadelphia experiment because he had published a book called The Case for the UFOs. Now, Jessup himself was a very serious scientist. I mean, he was, a credentialed astronomer. In fact, he was responsible for the discovery of many double star systems. He had perfected a method of discovering, how to locate these types of star systems. So, in other words, he's part of mainstream science, and that mainstream science would prefer to forget because he's one of the earliest credentialed scientists to get involved with the UFO phenomenon and actually to publish about it. Jessup's approach was that UFOs and the strange megalithic sites on Earth were somehow all connected, and he was looking for a kind of a physics explanation of what tied them all together. So he publishes this book, and the book itself then turns up at the Pentagon in a very unusual way, because it was mailed to a Commander Hoover or Admiral Furseth, depending on which version of the story you want to follow. I kind of get into the details of it in the book, that were both members of the Navy's Project Orbiter Committee and both members of the Office of Naval Research, ONR, which does a lot of the classified research for the Navy. So this becomes a part of the story, and we'll get to how all this kind of ties in with the Nazis, because there's a very peculiar tie in there, too.
Yeah.
But the book was annotated when it was sent to the Navy officers in the Pentagon. And there were all these marginal notes in different colored inks with very peculiar, misspellings of words and very peculiar English diction that talked not only about a cosmic war, but also talked about an experiment that the Navy ran during World War II that made a ship invisible. Okay. So needless to say, these Navy officers were rather, intrigued by all of this, and they contacted Jessup, do you know anything about this, and what do you make of it? Jessup himself, in the meantime, had been contacted by Carlos Allende, who, of course, is the actual origin of the Philadelphia experiment story, who had written him 3 letters. We only possess 2 today. Mm-hmm. The first one is lost. But these letters kind of outlined the experiment, and when the Navy showed him this annotated copy of his own book, he noticed that the style of diction and the spellings, the weird capitalizations and underlinings and what have you, were similar to these letters from Carlos Allende, so he showed these to the Navy. So the Navy decides that, okay, we're going to print this book up in a small-run publication and circulate it to some of our top people. They contact a company in Dallas called the Varro Company, V-A-R-O, and the Varro Company apparently prints up copies of this book with the annotations. Okay, that's the key point here. And then circulates it to some top people in the Navy. So that's the origin of the Varro edition. So this is how Jessup becomes involved in all of this. And one of Allende's clues about the nature of the physics behind this experiment kind of led Jessup himself, I believe, to consider very carefully what Allende was saying. And namely, as an astronomer, he would have been familiar with Einstein's unified field theory of 1928. And I think he began investigating very seriously on his own this experiment. Now, needless to say, as happens to many people that snoop too carefully, mm-hmm. He dies under some very mysterious circumstances. He was found by some local police in Florida with his car windows rolled up and a hose running from his muffler to the car. He was still alive, barely, when the police found him. They rushed him to a hospital, but he had either died on the way to the hospital or at the hospital. Again, the record's unclear. But Jessup himself, in his contacts within the ufology community and various friends, was talking and acting, they noticed, very peculiarly, and he was acting as if he expected something would happen to him. So there's always been this big question mark over the death of Dr. Jessup as to whether or not he actually committed suicide, or in fact if he had gotten too close to something that the powers that be didn't want him to know and was deliberately murdered. So, this is a very serious story, mm-hmm. Therefore either way one takes it.
Yeah, and you definitely, go in this part of speaking about Jessup and his book and Allende, breaking down some of what was said and some of the notations that were made, and one of the things was that it was believed that maybe even 3 sources had made these notations in the book.
Yeah, the annotated copy of the book was got a hold of, as a matter of fact, by Gray Barker, who was a well-known early ufologist. And he actually published for a while with his old Saucerian press, published the Varro edition. And it was his opinion that the annotations were made by 3 different people. And, as best as I can tell, his reasons for doing so were because the handwriting was slightly different. But it's very clear from a comparison of those annotations that I cite extensively, as extensively as I can in the book. If you compare those annotations with the letters of Allende, which I also cite extensively, it's very clear that at least one of those annotators was Allende himself. Mm-hmm. So, it's and I should mention that the Varro edition, it's very, very hard to come by.
Right.
So, I cite as much of it in the book as possible, to a much greater extent than Charles Berlitz and William Moore did in their book about the Philadelphia experiment. Because from what I can tell, I don't even know if they had access to it. They certainly knew about it. But, other than Gray Barker and Brad Steiger and some of the well-known names in ufology, the Varro edition is very hard to come by. So I cite it extensively for that reason, so that people can actually see the comparison between Allende and those annotations.
Now, the Navarro edition also was printed. There was kind of two runs of it, right? There was one that left it all in color, because of the annotations. They were three different colors, wasn't it?
Well, actually, the Navarro in the annotations, the colors I think were actually four: blue, green, red, and kind of a blackish purple type of ink. The Navarro annotated edition, when it was printed up by the Navarro Company, actually only printed it in two colors: the main text in black, and then the annotated portions of it were printed in a red mimeograph ink. If you can remember those old ditto machines that they ran in elementary schools, that's basically what they were doing. So, a nightmarish task to do something like that. But that's what the actual Navarro edition was.
So now, what would have been the Navy's, interest in the case for UFOs? Even with these notations in it, because he really, in my understanding, is that Jessup was, there was a lot of things that he was covering in it. Between the antiquity of man, the propulsion, how UFOs were,
right.
How they, traveled.
Right. Well, the edition, the interest, I think, is twofold. The first is that at this time, the Navy is the principal agent, one of the principal agents in the early space program. And in that particular committee that the annotated edition was sent to, you had some major heavy hitters in the space program that were trying to figure out a way to put up America's first artificial satellite. So the interest is there and immediate, from the standpoint that anything concerning anti-gravity is going to be of interest to the Navy and to the government. That's the first reason. The second reason is obviously because in the annotations themselves, you find the first mention of this World War II experiment with the Navy making a ship invisible. Mm-hmm. So, you've got this very strange book on UFOs that's annotated in a very strange way by either one or three people, and talking about anti-gravity and disappearing ships.
Yeah.
So, the Navy's going to take at least a kind of a perfunctory interest and at least investigate this, and that's how that got started.
So now, in those annotations was Allende. He was kind of telling Jessup, "You're on the right track. This is
right.
This is exactly you're hitting it right on the head." Right.
Yes, he was. And, like I say, I try and kind of reconstruct the thought process of Dr. Jessup in the book from all the available textual evidence. And basically what I come down to is that Jessup would have realized that the only theory within the Unified Field Theory's papers that he knew about that was associated with the name of Einstein, that could possibly deal not only in terms of anti-gravity, but deal in terms of making a ship optically invisible, was some sort of version of his 1928 Unified Field Theory with this peculiar idea of torsion, of bending and folding and spiraling the fabric of space-time itself. Now, in that respect, it's probable, in my opinion, that Jessup also stumbled across at some point in his research the idea of Gabriel Crone, that these theories were practically engineerable even if they were incomplete, because otherwise he would not have pursued the story to the extent that he did.
Mm-hmm. All right. So what gives Allende credibility?
Well, until very recently, there were many people that were inclined to dismiss him because he deliberately designed a little incident in which he tried to cast doubt over his own allegations. He later claimed at a certain point in his life that he had made the whole story up, and so on and so forth, and he actually hit up the president of the Farrell Company for some money at one point, for a kind of a blackmail operation. But then he turns around, and even in the act of discrediting his story, he never comes right out and says specifically that what he wrote in these letters to Jessup were lies. So the man was a bit of a mystery, and many people were inclined to dismiss the story on the basis of this particular incident and Allende's own self-evident instability. The problem is that there were a couple of researchers that were on Coast to Coast a few years back who published a little booklet in which they uncovered the actual merchant marine secret logs of the ship that Allende was on. And in the reconstruction of the information in those logs, which I incorporate in the book, and I have actually the pictures of these entries in the logs, you can see that the Parazed is in the approximate same vicinity as the Eldridge is when Allende is alleging the experiment took place. And, well, anyway, Allende never says these things. He does say that the experiment was performed at sea. In other words, it wasn't in a dockyard at all. And it was performed, therefore, under, full combat conditions. Now, this is interesting because if you read these logs of his ship very carefully, it was part of a convoy. And as I discovered, the ship itself is apparently ordered as part of a rescue operation to the Eldridge to romp ahead of the convoy without escort. And I get into the reasons why the commander of the convoy would have done this. Basically, it boils down to the fact that his particular ship was carrying a bunch of German prisoners, and it's probable, or at least possible, that German military intelligence may have known this and therefore not fired on the ship with its U-boats and sunk a bunch of their own soldiers. But in any case, it's putting all the pieces together, really, that kind of vindicates Allende's story. So, in my opinion, then, the experiment did happen, and it happened more or less at exactly as Allende describes it. And one final thing I might mention here, Jeremiah, is that if you read Allende's letters carefully, even though they're scrambled, you can kind of sense the man's instability when you read these letters. But you can also sense from reading them that he is genuinely trying to describe as best as he knows how something that he came across or was a witness to. And it's so totally unsettled him and unnerved him that he's really struggling with himself to kind of rationalize what he saw. Mm-hmm. Well, that's an interesting part of the story, and I'm so glad you mentioned it. You're kind of the first one to pick up on that. Coast to Coast had these two people on back in 2003, I think it was, and I'm an avid Coast listener, and I'm listening that night with rapt attention. And they're describing what they discovered with these logs. And I said, well, I've got to get their booklet. So I mailed their money order out and waited for the booklet, and it finally came. Well, on the show, they had also mentioned that they were writing a complete book about it. And I, put in a pre-order for it and waited and waited and waited and never heard from them. So I finally wrote them a letter, and the letter was returned, okay? So I assumed that they had either just dropped off the face of the earth or decided that they're not going to research this anymore, or, whatever happened. Then within the last 6 months, I began to get emails. I haven't ever discussed this on the air any time before. That finally put me into contact with Mr. Cunningham. And basically, I think from the exchanges that we had, I think that he kind of backed off the story a little bit, because in spite of the discoveries that he made in the logbooks, he had apparently also, in his lectures around the country, gone into some very wild versions of the Philadelphia experiment legend, and certainly I do not adhere to those. I don't believe in the stories of certain people that, they time traveled back and forth and they've got this split identity and and so on and so forth. That, in my opinion, is not very likely. Theoretically, it's certainly possible given the type of science involved, but it's such a remote possibility. I just don't think it's possible. So, in spite of this, Strom and Cunningham's research on the logbooks is really very, very superb, and their little booklet, which is probably now very rare, is just a wonderful 70-page masterpiece of reasoning and argument from the standpoint of the history of the experiment.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, let's, you mentioned earlier, and of course I'm sitting here in the two names, Berlitz and Moore, on their book, they did one on the Philadelphia experiment, and this started bringing more light to this amazing feat that the Navy pulled off, and which even is believed to be accidental.
Yeah, this is one of the key things, and I'm glad you mentioned that too. Let's put ourselves in the shoes of a scientist for the moment and kind of rationalize the story from the standpoint of the scientist. It's during the height of World War II, and Allende himself never says that the experiment was designed to get the ship to become optically invisible. In fact, he doesn't really say much about the physics of the experiment other than that it was his belief or understanding that Einstein's unified field theory was somehow involved with it. Mm-hmm. So if we're the U.S. Navy and we see the war clouds of World War II gathering, one of the things that they probably would have noticed is statements that were made, and I go into these in the book, that Nikola Tesla made during World War I to the then Assistant U.S. Secretary of the Navy, and his name was Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Mm-hmm. That we could take these very simple electrical inventions that Tesla had come up with and use them to deflect German torpedoes and projectiles around a ship. So in other words, you have kind of, you have Tesla making kind of a World War I version of Star Wars. So, you've got this background percolating in the Navy's head during World War II. But you're not going to rush right out and confiscate during the height of the war an entire destroyer escort, which is badly needed for convoy duty, unless you know the concept works. Okay?
Right.
So at some point, you're going to have to come up with selling the Navy on the idea. You're going to have to do proof of concept experiments on a small scale. Mm-hmm. And in my thinking, the most plausible thing that the Navy would have done was to take some of its model warships that they test down at the Taylor Model Basin at the time in Maryland and perform these proof of concept experiments on these small models. And if that works, then, we can take a ship from the point that it comes down the slipway and delegate it to a full-scale experiment prior to its actual commissioning. And there's a great deal of evidence that Berlitz and Moore present in their book that I kind of reproduce in mine, that in fact this is what you see with the Eldridge. You see a discrepancy between its actual commissioning and when it comes down the slipway that would have made it possible for it to be involved in some experiment of that sort. So I think what happens here is that the Navy does a proof of concept experiment. What they were probably looking for, and I agree with Berlitz and Moore here, what they were probably looking for was some measure of radar invisibility, or at least a heavy amount of radar diffraction, okay? Mm-hmm. What they did when they did the full-scale experiment on the Eldridge, which incidentally, if you kind of track out the history, it was probably done around 120 miles from Bermuda, which opens up another can of worms. Mm-hmm. But in any case, I think what the Navy did when they ran the full-scale experiment was they crossed some threshold by virtue of the parameters of the experiment, which they did not know existed. And as a result, the experiment ran away from its intended results and achieved actual optical invisibility. And there was this moment of panic, and they pressed the panic button, and they needed to rescue the crew and put out fires that had broken out on the ship, which Allende mentions in his letters. And this is how the actual experiment was actually performed. Now, this is important, and the reason I went into all of this kind of roundabout explanation is that, it never dawned on anybody until about the 1990s, well, let's do a proof of concept experiment. Okay? All right. And some American engineers actually did this. Is this story true from a scientific standpoint or not? And their names are Coram and Daum. are their last names. And they even published a little paper, a scientific paper, on the experiment that they did to find out if using these kinds of electromagnetic coils you could induce some sort of radar diffraction, okay?
Mm-hmm.
So they do this proof of concept experiment. They take a piece of iron, they immerse it in electrical coils, and then immerse it in a solution of rock salt and water. They aim a radar klystron tube at this thing, and they turn on the coils. So what happens next, I think, probably had their jaws on the floor. Because it certainly had mine on the floor when I read their paper. The water that they had immersed this device in boils and literally kind of flies out of the tank. Well, this is an important point, because one of the things that Allende says is that when he came upon the Eldridge, he couldn't see it, but he could see the outline of the hull in the water, and the water around the ship was, in his words, boiling.
Right.
Okay? So you have a little scientific confirmation of one of his allegations. And then the fact that the water itself leaps out of the tank, in other words, it shoots away from their little electromagnetic device, is a little confirmation of the fact that he sees the outline of the hull as well.
Mm-hmm.
But what they really noticed was that when they turned this radar gun on the experimental device itself, they did get a significant measure, as a matter of fact, of radar diffraction. So they speculate that, it's only a little step further, under the right circumstances with enough power and so on and so forth, to configure coils in such a way that you might achieve optical invisibility as well, although they themselves admit that this was probably an accident. So yeah, this was really kind of the astonishing thing that I uncovered in my research, was that somebody finally actually took the time to do an experiment on it.
It only took quite some time. Now, the Philadelphia experiment supposedly took place, was it October of 43?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, some time.
Allende makes it clear that, in his words, it was early October of 1943. The logs of his ship indicate that it was toward late September. So when they came upon this incident, so it's somewhere in the time frame, say, of the last week and a half of September and the first week and a half of October, somewhere in there in 1943.
Mm-hmm. Now, some of the things that I found really interesting was some of what the crew, because they had a crew on this ship, right, experienced, and some of the ways it was described of like being stuck in molasses and frozen, and right, things along that. I mean, that was just, and how they kind of corrected this problem.
Oh boy, an excellent question, and it brings us right back to Allende and something very peculiar that he says in his letter. One of the expressions that he uses to describe, this being stuck phenomenon, and incidentally, he also describes crew members that once they were subsequently exposed after the experiment, even to a weak magnetic field, they could either become stuck like that, in other words, literally frozen with paralysis, or they would disappear completely, which again is one of the stranger things that he says in his letters. But he never talks about people embedded in bulkheads. This to me was kind of a surprise. But when he describes these two effects, one of the expressions he uses, and I'm quoting him exactly now, is that they were stuck in a kind of hyperfield within the field. Okay?
Uh-huh.
Now, this is a really, really interesting statement for someone like Allende to make, because it means to me that he had either attempted to research this phenomenon on his own after the fact, or that he had talked to somebody, a physicist or an engineer most likely, who knew about what torsion actually is. Torsion precisely is, particularly the kind that we're dealing with the Philadelphia experiment, is a field that is set up by electromagnetic interferometry. In other words, you would take two or more electromagnetic fields and create an interference pattern within an object. And that interference pattern itself sets up a kind of a a field within those fields, okay? It's a field within a field. This is an exact description of what torsion does.
Mm-hmm.
And, I have a new book right now at a publisher in which I discuss some Russian research into torsion. And one of the things that the Russians discovered, a fellow by another astronomer, incidentally, a famous one by the name of Nikolai Kozyrev, one of the things that he discovered was that torsion can imprint itself on an object and remain in the object long after the original conditions that set it up disappear. Mm-hmm. So in other words, it's very possible from the basics of torsion itself and what we know experimentally about it. It is possible then that the crew kept that field long after the coils on the ship were turned off. Mm-hmm. And when re-exposed to similar conditions, that field kind of reactivates itself. And hence you get these people being stuck, or in the more radical case, vanishing right in front of your eyes.
Yeah.
So, you have to piece together Allende's allegations with what is known in the scientific literature, and what kind of surprised me is that in almost each and every case, you can find somewhere something where a similar effect is noticed and talked about. That's the key.
Mm-hmm. Now, and there's, I guess, accounts of some of these even 6 months beyond this disappearing. Just
right.
There was something. If correct me if I'm wrong. It was about one who kind of walked through the wall and disappeared.
Well, this is an aspect of the story I have never been able to trace down. Jessup himself, when he began investigating the experiment, and Berlitz and Moore mention it in their book, and I've never ever been able to verify this. They mention that Jessup found an article in the Philadelphia paper where apparently a fight had broken out in a local bar. And the waitress who observed this fight, between servicemen that were on their off-duty hours, she said that she saw some of these people that were involved in the fight just disappear. Poof, gone. And, you can imagine a Philadelphia newspaper editor, doing a 2-inch column filler at some, back page in the newspaper.
Yeah.
Commenting on that. Well, needless to say, the paper wrote it down to the fact that the waitress was a little tipsy. But I have never been able to verify that story or track it down. But the interesting thing about the story is that it is consistent with what Allende states in his letters. And that, in turn, is consistent with the general principles that we have noticed about torsion fields and their ability to kind of remain imprinted in an object long after the original establishing conditions have vanished. So again, I'm not willing to discount the theory or the story altogether simply because I haven't been able to verify it, because it's consistent with the overall physics.
Mm-hmm. Now, as the crew themselves, is there accounts of exactly what they were seeing on the ship? As the ship disappeared, could they still kind of see it, or could they see each other, or were others outside of that were witnessing this? Could they not see the ship, but see some of the crew member kind of almost like hanging in midair?
Well, this is a peculiar thing, and another excellent question. If you go back to Allende's original letters and the Farrell edition itself, it never mentions what the crew on the ship itself sees. But if you read carefully between the lines of what Allende says, and then the way I kind of piece together the history in the book, if you read very carefully, the suggestion is there that if you could not see the ship, you could at least see the fires that had broken out on the ship for some reason. So, apparently you could see certain things outside the ship. We don't know what the crew on the ship actually was able to see. My guess is, however, that it would have been such an extreme effect to produce optical invisibility that not only would it have had strong hallucinogenic properties to the crew within the magnetic fields themselves that were being set up on the ship, but that it would also have interfered with the ship's equipment and rangefinders and so on and so forth to a severe degree. So what they may have actually seen, Lord only knows.
Yeah. And let me get another question here before we get. We're really closing in on our break here, and excuse me if you've already kind of covered it. But in talking about this whole crew about being frozen, stuck in molasses, the laying of the hands was definitely mentioned about that. This was how they unfroze each other.
Right. Allende states in his letters that when a crew member who begins to get into this paralytic state, or as he calls it, stuck in molasses, that the only way to get them out of it, and you have to do it as soon as possible, is just simply run up to this person and lay your hands on them. In other words, touch them to get them out of that state. And again, that isn't entirely inconsistent with what is known about the effects of these strong torsion fields. Because for some reason, a person that is not exposed to those original establishing conditions can undo them by touching that object and physically imprinting their own field within the field upon it. So in other words, that's not entirely inconsistent either. It certainly is one of the more peculiar things that Allende says, electrical connections to it. And it's interesting to note what Berlitz and Moore say about him. At this time, he is an officer in the Navy, and he's in charge of the radar school at Annapolis, at the Naval Academy. And he has a nervous breakdown, close to the period that the Philadelphia experiment is allegedly performed. Now, this to me is a significant clue in this whole step-up process of experimentation that you mentioned prior to the break that I try and kind of outline in the book. Because after we've tested it on models, the next thing we're going to do is we're going to do limited full-scale tests on an actual ship at sea under conditions that would simulate German radar. And I think that it's very likely then that someone like Thomas Townsend Brown would have been involved, at least in that aspect of the experiment. And the reasons for his breakdown, many people have speculated that he probably saw some of the grisly results of the experiment. The legend takes over there rather than the actual history. And I think really probably what Townsend Brown was nervous about with the experiment was his understanding and realization that the possibility did exist, and this was also mentioned in Berlitz and Moore by other scientists involved with the project. The possibility did exist, even though remote, that they might actually achieve some sort of optical invisibility and have difficulty in shutting the field down. So, kind of put that into context with what we've said before about the strange effects that Allende talked about in his letter, and I think that the case is the circumstantial case is more or less made that the Navy achieved results with the experiment far beyond what they were actually looking for. Yeah,
definitely sounds like it. Now, one other thing, definitely, I don't want to run out of time so we can get into the Nazi Bell, because we have a huge fan of your research on the Nazi Bell, as well as some saying, what is the Nazi Bell? So that's definitely good. But before we get to that, Berlitz and Moore had also, I guess, stated in their book, The Philadelphia Experiment, Project Invisibility, that's the correct name of it, right?
Right.
That they had found something that Einstein was even employed by the U.S. Navy during World War II?
Yes, he was. And it's the exact thing that he was employed in, as a matter of fact, was in deflection of torpedoes, which takes us back to Tesla's original suggestion. So, apparently the Navy, I think, if you rationalize what they were attempting to do with this experiment, is that they realized that if you achieve any measure of radar deflection, you're also going to be altering very slightly the ballistic properties of the atmosphere and the water surrounding the ship. And certainly if you achieve optical invisibility, you're going to be altering them even more. So yes, all of that is a possibility and a rationalization for the experiment. They were looking for radar invisibility and a small measure of being able to deflect German projectiles off their course. And I get into that aspect of the experiment, which is not a very well known aspect of it, by pointing out that, the Army had a special kind of a solenoid that it used to test the ballistic properties of cannon barrels in production runs, to measure the minute amounts of deflection that each barrel had in a production run, by using the magnetic deflection in a solenoid as a magnetized shell is passing through it.
Mm-hmm.
So, I think this is an aspect that vindicates the experiment, because that technology certainly existed. All nations used them to proof their barrels and give their artillery commanders the proper data, ballistics data on the barrels that they were shooting. So, this is an aspect of the experiment that to me makes immense scientific and engineering sense. And Einstein's involvement, therefore, with the Navy in a project like that certainly points the finger once again towards the Philadelphia experiment.
Mm-hmm. Now, is there any belief or indication that the government has continued experimenting with this to date, or just stopped it?
Well, that's the $64,000 question. Yeah. Well, this brings us to a very interesting incident that I point out towards the end of the book, and what I think is going on here, and kind of the tie-in with the Nazis. In Berlitz and Moore's book, they have a picture, and I reproduce this picture in my own book, of the original Project Orbiter Committee of the Navy, taken somewhere at a conference room inside the Pentagon, presumably, and you see the actual Commander Hoover that was associated with the Varro edition seated at the end of this long table surrounded by a bunch of other people. One of the figures in the exact center of the picture, standing up, is the president of the Varro company, okay, the very company that makes the Varro edition. So you have these two individuals in the picture, but seated on the opposite side of the table, kind of alone, like he's kind of holding court, is none other than Dr. Werner von Braun.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? Now, interestingly enough, von Braun, his interest at a few years later is going to be precisely into anti-gravity. Anyone that's been following what Richard Hoagland's been doing with recent papers that he's posting up on his Enterprise site will know that von Braun had a keen interest in the subject due to some very peculiar things that NASA ran into and the Army ran into when they launched their first satellites. They weren't behaving quite like they thought they should,
All right.
So von Braun goes out and starts digging into anti-gravity. Well, if I'm correct that the Varro edition was probably circulated to that Project Orbiter Committee, then one of the people who's getting a copy of it is, guess who? Werner von Braun.
Mm-hmm.
So, that there's the Nazi tie-in to a certain extent. But, the whole question of what we were doing with this technology since then is very peculiar, because one of the things that I point out that this Strom and Cunningham had run into when they were digging for these logbooks of Allende's ship was that when they tried to check certain logs out from the precise time period of the experiment itself that Allende suggested, which was late September, early October 1943, all those logbooks were utterly, completely, totally missing in the National Archives. What they got back, and I reproduce this in the book, is that apparently someone had checked them out and never returned them. And the person that had checked them out was someone associated with the U.S. Coast Guard.
Right, yeah.
And if you stop and think about it, what a perfect place to hide a black project like that, because no one is going to think to look there. So, in my opinion, what probably happens is, the experiment ran away on the Navy. And one of the two things, most likely both, is going to happen. The Navy at that point concludes that the project is too dangerous for practical application during the war. Okay? So from the standpoint of it ever being used during the invasion of Europe or anything like that, that's definitely out of the question. So in that sense, the project is shut down. But in another sense, the Navy realizes, hey, we've just stumbled across something extraordinarily significant. And it's going to go as deeply black as it can possibly go. And given, von Braun's own involvement in some of these very weird areas of physics, it would not surprise me that if you dig long and hard enough, and I've got to admit, I certainly haven't done that, nor do I think has anybody else, because it's just so hard to do. The Navy to this day persists in saying that this experiment was never, ever done, which I think by now, I think the case is pretty well made that certainly something along these lines was done during World War II, and the Navy just doesn't want to talk about it.
All right.
So, give the U.S. Navy 60+ years to pursue this technology and its development, and you kind of have to stop and think and shudder at what they may have actually discovered in the meantime.
Mm-hmm. Well, now, before we kind of switch gears, or not really, because it's all kind of tied in together,
Right.
definitely through the unified field theory, any last things we may not cover, and of course you go into a lot more detail in the book, Secrets of the Unified Field, and of course, give where our listeners can find us on your website as well, right fast.
My website is www.GizaDeathStar, that's GIZADETHSTAR.com, and it's all one word, all lowercase. They can find out information about me, read my little articles that I posted there. If they want to get the book itself, they can either, go through Amazon or their local Barnes & Noble or Borders, or they can go directly to the publisher, which is Adventures Unlimited Press. There's a toll-free number during normal business hours for that. That's 1-800-718-4514, or they can go to adventuresunlimitedpress.com online. And again, that's all one word, and it's all lowercase.
Okay. Of course, if anybody has any trouble, we have all this linked from our website, shadowsanddarkradio.com, and we're definitely hoping to look to get Secrets of the Unified Field and a few other your works in our web store. So I'm really, fingers crossed.
Cool.
So I've been talking with Jerry Smith, and of course, hopefully that's going to happen here sometime soon. So anything that we've kind of missed that you really wanted to get out there, especially on the side of the Philadelphia experiment?
Well, I can't really think of anything, right now, other than to stress the fact, as we get into the Nazi Bell aspect, that the Navy had rationalized this most likely on the 1928 version of Einstein's unified theory that incorporated the idea of torsion, and also from the standpoint that Gabriel Krone's papers were demonstrating that certain electrical phenomena could only be explained on the basis of some of these kinds of theories, and therefore that they were not just theoretical abstractions, but they were actually engineerable theories. Those are the 2 points, because when we start talking about the Nazi Bell, we're talking about the same thing, but with one important difference. The Philadelphia experiment, as I've tried to kind of outline tonight, was an experiment that was only designed to achieve a very limited effect, and it ran away from them. They did not expect the results that they got. But when you cross the ocean to Nazi Germany and are dealing with the Bell experiment, the Germans rationalized that experiment much more thoroughly than we did on this side of the ocean. And the effects that they achieved with the device, they were actually looking for. So that's the key difference. It's the same physics that's involved. It's the same conceptual foundation, but in the case of the Bell, we're dealing with a much more carefully thought out series of experiments. Let's put it that way.
Mm-hmm. All right. Well, let's start off then with exactly kind of a two. Not really. We'll get another question here in just a minute, and we've already got a few from the chat room in regards to the Nazi Bell. But what exactly is the Nazi Bell?
Okay. to put it in context, it is Nazi Germany's most highly classified secret weapons research project. It's classified higher than their atomic bomb, which incidentally I think was a successful project. And, that puts me right in the face of the Allied legend about American nuclear engineering superiority, and I outline that case in another one of my books. But I did it precisely to show that the physics that the Germans were investigating during World War II was very different and in an almost conceptually totally different universe than that of their Allied counterparts. The Bell is Nazi Germany's most highly classified secret weapons project. It's classified Kriegsentscheidend, which in the German means war decisive. So, if the atom bomb in their eyes, and even the hydrogen bomb, because they certainly knew about that possibility too, if those two things do not rate a classification of war decisive, then what does? So, you kind of put it in that context, and you get an idea of the extraordinary power that the Nazis were after with this device. Let me describe the device, and then I'll describe what I think they were trying to accomplish with it.
Okay.
It was bell-shaped, hence the name the Bell. It was a ceramic outer casing, some sort of ceramic-type metal, that was about 15 to 18 feet tall, about 9 to 12 feet wide. It was cryogenically cooled, an important point, with either liquid oxygen or liquid nitrogen, something like that. There was a serum, which in the German literature was codenamed Serum 525, which was a kind of a thick violet maroon colored goo that most likely was some isotope of mercury and compounded with some other radioactive isotope. I've recently finished a new book called The Philosopher's Stone, in which I make a kind of a circumstantial case that I think one of those elements was thorium-229 and other things.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a reason I suggest thorium, but anyway, that's kind of a long story. But anyway, this serum was put into the central core of the Bell, in which there were two counter-rotating drums inside the device. And in my rationalization, I depart from other researchers in this respect. I do not believe that these drums were nested one inside the other. I believe they were nested one on top of the other. And this goo was then spun up at extraordinarily high speeds. What that will do is it will start inertially to spin polarize the atoms and molecules of this serum on one plane. Since they're going in opposite directions, you can already see what they're doing. It's torsion-based right from the start. And they're probably also electrically rotating this substance as well in order to maximize the torsion shear effect. Then, around this device, there are portals for heavy-duty, high-voltage electrical cabling. And this, again, is where I depart, and I get into all of this case in Secrets of the Unified Field for why I think these things are there. I believe that this cabling was for direct current, high-voltage electrical pulsing, using the spinning drums as one polarity and then the center of the device as another polarity. You're pulsing this spinning goo that's highly radioactive, and it's very dense and very heavy. You're creating a plasma, in other words. You're supercooling it, you're creating a plasma, you're pulsing it with enormous electricity. And the result, I think, if you read the accounts of the concentration camp victims that were mentioned by Igor Vitkovsky, who kind of uncovered the story of the Bell, they discover seeing flying barrels rising above the tree line at night and glowing a pale blue color. So, in other words, the Bell levitated. So the Nazis, I think, are after three things. The first and most obvious is a means of using torsion-based physics to create some sort of space-time bubble around this device and allow it to create an anti-gravity effect, in other words, to levitate, right? Creating a field propulsion device. But the second thing they're after, and this is an important thing, is that they're after a means for cheap and free energy. And here's a really crucial part of the Bell story. The Bell was under the aegis of an SS four-star general by the name of Emil Matsuv, who headed a department of the SS called the Forschung, Entwicklung und Patente, the Research, Development, and Patents section, which had a subsection called Entwicklungsstelle 4, Development Area 4. Sounds like Bob Lazar's S4. It was a department of the SS whose top secret brief was to make Nazi Germany energy independent. Okay? So another thing that they're after with this device is free energy. And then finally, the very classification of the Bell as war decisive itself means that they are looking to weaponize the physics that they discover or are testing with the device. So in other words, if you weaponize a physics that can tap into the very fabric of space-time, of course, you have the potential to create a weapon that's going to make a hydrogen bomb look like a firecracker. So, yeah, these Nazis had rationalized this physics out very, very thoroughly and very carefully. But let's look at what this means in terms of the Bell. This means that the Bell itself is none of those things. It is not a field propulsion device. It is not a free energy device. It is not a weapon. It is a technology that allows them to explore the various avenues of that physics that will lead to those things, okay? Mm-hmm. And by all accounts of what we know about the Bell, they were more than successful because, I have two books at a publisher right now. One is at Farrell House, and then another book is currently at Adventures Unlimited, and that book is called The Nazi International. Because I continue the story of the Bell. I've been able to do some research, and I'm fairly convinced now that one place that part of the experiment went to was Argentina. In other words, the Bell itself never, ever fell into Allied hands after the war. Right. The Nazis kept their own hands on that technology. Mm-hmm. So, it's tremendous. It's a tremendous story.
Now, you definitely mentioned kind of three key players within all this, and one has been brought up in the chat room already. And one of those is, and please correct me if I'm pronouncing it wrong, but Kammler?
Oh, yes. You've got an alert chat room group. Very alert. General Hans Kammler, he was another four-star SS general. And he headed up a group inside of the SS called the Kammerstab, the Kammler Staff. It was headquartered inside the old Skoda munitions works in Pilsen, Czechoslovakia, inside their engineering division. Now, what Kammler did, Jeremiah, was he set up basically the first Area 51, because all of Czechoslovakia had been made a Reich protectorate of the SS by Nazi Germany after they took it over in March of 1939. So in other words, they turned the whole country into an SS preserve. Uh-huh. And around the mountains that border Czechoslovakia and Germany, they create a literal rat's run of underground installations, some of them huge. Okay? Mm-hmm. Kammler heads up this research think tank, and it's important to understand what this man and what this think tank are. By the end of the war, SS General Kammler is the head of all, and I mean literally every last scrap, including the Bell, of Nazi Germany's secret research projects. Their jets, their rockets, their infrared heat-seeking missiles, their television-guided missiles, their fuel air bombs, the whole ball of wax is under his jurisdiction. He is one of the most extraordinarily powerful men in the Third Reich. Mm-hmm. In 1945, he dies 4 times, under different circumstances each time. Hmm. In other words, he goes completely and utterly missing. And incidentally, around the same time period, a massive 6-engine Junkers 390 aircraft, which is capable of nonstop flight from Nazi Germany to Argentina. This is an enormous airplane. You don't just go bury it somewhere in a field. This plane goes missing, and the last picture of it, as a matter of fact, is taken at an airfield in Prague in April of 1945. The Bell itself goes missing. All of its project documentation goes missing. The SS murders 60 of the scientists and technicians that were working on the project just to keep it quiet. So this whole thing, in other words, Kammler, in my opinion, most likely took this project under orders, incidentally. He's not just taking it on a whim, but he's taking it under orders. This is part of a very long-term Nazi strategic plan that I get into in the Nazi International that's in press right now. But he takes this whole project, its project documentation, this massive aircraft, and hightails it out of Europe, probably to Argentina. Mm-hmm. Because there's certain things going on down there that resemble the Bell too closely. Okay, let's put it that way.
Right.
The other thing about Kammler that most people don't know is that he is closely associated with Werner von Braun because, of course, he's the head of all of these secret weapons projects. And if you carefully look then at what the Nazis are doing at the end of the war, number one, they're steering General Patton by means of some very clever military psychological operations directly towards the main installations in Kammler's secret weapons research empire. So alone of all the American field commanders at the end of World War II, Patton's units are the ones that enter Pilsen, Czechoslovakia, where Kammler's group and staff is headquartered. And it's his units that are entering most of the installations, the underground installations, that the Allies didn't even know about at the end of the war. So General Patton, by virtue of the field intelligence reports that he's getting, he has probably the most complete picture of any Allied officer in the field at the end of the war of the extent and nature of German secret weapons research. Kammler goes missing, the Bell goes missing, and the Germans very cleverly, make sure that we get the top rocket scientists while the Soviets get the middle echelon technicians and managers that are able to piece the rocket paperwork back together. Mm-hmm. You see what's going on?
Right, yeah.
They're dividing the spoils, but they're keeping the best stuff to themselves.
Right. Now we had a couple questions. You definitely answered one.
Sure.
So we won't ask that one. I'm trying to. We do have someone in the chat room who is very knowledgeable in regards to the Nazi Bell because he's definitely followed your works. Mm-hmm. So the second question, it was kind of a two-part question. So the second part of it, and this is from Olav, who is hanging out in our chat room. Mm-hmm. What about any rumors that Kammler moved his programs to Base 211 in Antarctica?
Okay. There have always been persistent rumors that the Germans had some sort of base in Antarctica. And there is a bit of circumstantial evidence to suggest that they did have something there, because prior to the war, they outfitted an expedition to go to Antarctica, drop little swastika flags on spikes all over the continent, and claim a whole chunk of it for themselves. Apparently on this expedition, they discovered some warm water lakes and underground ice caves and the beginnings of the Atlantic Trench that ran all the way down to Antarctica. So, the German Navy certainly has an interest. But here's the peculiar thing about this expedition. It was sponsored by none other than Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering, the head of the Luftwaffe. And this is not a man that's going to be sponsoring a science fair project.
Yeah.
He's just not the type. So, we don't really know what the military interests that the Nazis had in Antarctica was. We do know that Grand Admiral Dönitz, who commanded the U-boat fleet during the war, had peculiarly several U-boats operating in the South Atlantic at the end of the war. Several of them were very large and Nazi Germany's latest type of U-boat, which, when you consider what they were putting into the seas in 1945, the jaw just kind of drops. These were hydrogen peroxide electropropulsion U-boats that had a submerged speed of about 17 to 20 knots and could cruise for great lengths at that speed underwater. That's just unheard of for the day. More than a match for anything that any other navy's putting into their submarine fleet at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And it had a unique means of targeting by means of microphones placed around the hull of the U-boat. They would target by sound differences of sonar targets. So this thing was a holy terror, and thank goodness the war ended when it did. Several of these things are cruising around the South Atlantic, and they show up in Argentina fully 3 months after the end of the war. And the Argentines naturally asked the Germans, well, what were you doing between May 7th of 1945 and August 9th, Yeah. Oh, we were just kind of sailing around. Well, that has always fueled the speculation that they were stalking or doing something at this German Antarctic base, and that much of this secret Nazi research went there. My own opinion is that it would have been highly unlikely that the Germans constructed a base capable and large enough with enough infrastructure in Antarctica to continue some of that secret research. More likely it was a very small base, a weather station, perhaps with a few troops and a few rudimentary laboratories and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. I think the real center, the Vatican City, so to speak, excuse me, of this post-war Nazi International is actually located in Rio Negro province of Argentina. And I'll be even more specific.
Okay.
And I make this case in the new book that Adventures Unlimited is doing. It should be out in about 2 to 3 months. It's called The Nazi International. I'll be even more specific as to where I think it's located. I think if you draw a circle of 100 miles radius from the city of San Carlos de Bariloche, Argentina, within that circle, you will find a very large, and I do mean large, I'm talking about 10,000 square miles large, Nazi enclave. It certainly existed there at the end of the war. It had some rather interesting visitors. Visitors that were supposed to be long dead.
Right.
It's just truly astonishing, and folks, I'm not making this up because I've been privileged to make certain contacts that have shared photographs with me. Okay.
All right.
So you get some of these photographs in these 2 new books, particularly the Nazi International. But that's all I can say about it right now.
All right. That's fair. We definitely got someone along again in the chat room saying he's not sure if he can wait 2 or 3 months.
Well, I can let out a little bit more of the story in kind of general terms. I do believe that the Bell Project, at least in some of its particulars, continued to be investigated there. Mm-hmm. I believe that, and make the case for, in the new book, that certain high-ranking Nazis, whose names would be readily recognizable if I were to mention them, mm-hmm. were in the area, so to speak. I can show you some coincidental pictographical proof in the new book that has this very odd and peculiar connection to the Nazi Bell, namely large metal drums. Okay? Mm-hmm. So, in other words, there's something going on in Argentina, and that's quite a story in itself. And of course, good old Juan Perón is involved in the story with the whole cast of characters.
Now, Lav in the chat is asking what your feelings are, your thoughts are of Operation High Jump.
Okay, that's another interesting thing. I do write about that in the very first book that I wrote about Nazi secret weapons. That's called Reich of the Black Sun. Mm-hmm. Interestingly enough, after the war, America outfitted a military expedition in 1947 to go to Antarctica. It included an escort-class carrier, a couple of destroyers, a submarine, a seaplane tender, and a battalion of Marines.
All right.
Okay, now, to me that in itself is highly suspicious because, these Marines are not going down there to shoot at penguins. And the military's excuse has always been, well, we needed to have special training for Arctic conditions. We could do that in Alaska.
All right.
We don't need to go all the way to Antarctica for that. So something down there certainly attracted America's military attention after the war. And Admiral Byrd, as a matter of fact, was kind of the nominal public relations head of this expedition. We went down there, outfitted this expedition for a period of 8 months. In other words, we were intending to be there and stay there for quite a while. But after about 8 weeks, we've had several of our planes go missing and so on and so forth, and Admiral Byrd, who's certainly no slouch when it comes to Arctic exploration, decides, well, it's best that we turn this expedition around and go home. On the way home, the expedition took with them several journalists from various Latin American countries, and one of them happened to be a journalist for the El Mercurio newspaper in Santiago de Chile. And Byrd gave him an interview. And I even reproduced the actual newspaper article itself, the Spanish article that the translation is from in Rise of the Black Sun. Admiral Byrd says, on returning to the United States, that we must immediately prepare for enemy fighters that can fly from pole to pole with amazing speed. And that's all he says. That's all the article quotes. Mm-hmm. And then Admiral Byrd is taken to the Pentagon. His logs, his diaries from the expedition and so on are completely classified to this day. So the speculation has always been, and I think that there may be a measure of truth to it, that he ran into, excuse me, mm-hmm. he ran into some Germans down there that had some sort of version of some of this late war advanced technology, and of course they just cut Byrd's expedition to pieces.
Right.
But I don't think that was the main headquarters or base for this Nazi research, this post-war Nazi research. But it's yet another, and your listener's quite right to point it out, it's yet another little piece of the story that may be significant in the long run.
Mm-hmm. Now here's another question. This is coming from Diane, who is from Australia. So I definitely want to say, we definitely appreciate our overseas listeners always.
Well, hello to Australia.
Yeah, I always, I just always find that flattering when we have overseas listeners who are tuned in live. Which just so I can mention it right fast, we have Superior Awesomeness in the chat room who is listening in from Sweden. So
oh wow,
a little bit of here and there, I guess, where they tune in.
Hello to Sweden as well.
So Diane is asking, is there any kind of connection with the new land of I'll probably butcher this, New Schwabenland?
Neuschwabenland?
Yeah.
Neuschwabenland is simply the name that the Germans gave to this section of Argentina that they claimed for themselves during their 1938-1939 expedition. So yeah, there is a connection because when Admiral Byrd lands in Antarctica, he lands at 3 different points and then begins a march inland. And you can see, if you look at these lines of march, that they're heading directly for that area that the Germans claimed, although they're kind of approaching it from the opposite side, so to speak. They're not approaching it from the sea, although he does make one direct sea approach, if I recall correctly. So yes, there's a connection there as well.
Okay. And I'm sad to say I took German for 3 years, and I'm struggling with all these German words. Is that sad?
I had German in high school, and My teachers were all Germans. South Dakota is full of a lot of German people, some of them that came here after the war. So, I had the real goose step drill when I took German.
that was the same here. I took it for 3 years in high school, and I had 2 different teachers. They both were German. So I didn't learn anything. So I guess it was high school. Now, another one of the things that you mentioned during this section about the Nazi bell, actually a couple, but I wanted to get this one as well, is about the, and I'm trying to remember the exact name, but an experiment that's stopped motors.
Oh, yes. In the Secrets of the Unified Field, I mentioned this interest that the Germans and incidentally the Italians had in developing these devices, electromagnetic pulse devices apparently, that were able to stop electrical motors from a short distance away. From what I've uncovered, I mentioned the episode of Mussolini and his wife. Mussolini telling his wife, who's planning to go out for a drive from Rome on a day in 1936, he tells her, well, drive down such and such a road at a certain time. And he doesn't tell her why. And she does. And her car completely stops. And, they try for a while to get it started, and they can't do it. And a little later, they are able to start it up again. She comes home and tells him about it. Well, apparently, Mussolini had some sort of secret project that was probably headed by Guglielmo Marconi, developing some of these devices. The Germans did too, although they were doing it on apparently a little bit bigger scale than were the Italians, and had a couple of transmitters of that sort in Germany. So, we're dealing, to kind of boil it down to the bottom line here, we're dealing with what I like to call the hyperdimensional Reich, because at every turn, when you examine some of their more avant-garde secret weapons projects, they're dealing in areas of physics that are at least a decade, if not several decades in the case of the Bell, ahead of their Allied counterparts in the way that they're thinking and rationalizing these things.
Mm-hmm. Wow, it's for those just tuning in, so we got a few more jumping in the chat room there. Of course, you are tuned in to Shadows in the Dark, and our guest tonight is Joseph P. Farrell, who's author of Secrets of the Unified Field, the Philadelphia Experiment, the Nazi Bell, and the Discarded Theory. And of course, we've mentioned throughout the show that this is kind of I guess would be a sequel to SS Brotherhood of the Bell.
Right. And
you also wrote another one on secret Nazi technology. Rank of the Black Sun, right?
Right. The Secrets of the Unified Field is the third book in this series. I have another book at Farrell House that will be coming out sometime around February of next year called The Philosopher's Stone, in which I continue an aspect of the Bell story. I investigate the actual serum that they're using inside the device. That's where I make the case that I think one of the elements that was involved in the recipe of that serum was most likely thorium-229. The other book that's in press right now with Adventures Unlimited that will be out in 2 to 3 months, although I wrote it after The Philosopher's Stone. That book is called The Nazi International, and it's a different book in some respects than the others on Nazi secret weapons in that I look at the wider picture of Nazi survival and what it might mean in the post-war world. But certainly the Bell is part of that story.
Right.
So it's kind of a 5-book series right now. It's not a story that you can easily tell in one book, and most people don't want to buy a 2,000-page book. So you have to break it up.
Right. Yeah, definitely. And I've seen some books along those lines. Now I think maybe we're trying to talk someone into calling in here who has some knowledge on this. I know can definitely expand some more. And now, and another one was the you're talking about the Hartz, is that right? Hartz Mountain time travel time machine rumor?
Oh yes, yeah. That's one of the most interesting things in the whole story that I get into in Secrets of the Unified Field. There is a rumor that a researcher by the name of Henry Stevens uncovered. He mentions it in a wonderful book that he wrote called Hitler's Secret Weapons, Suppressed Technology and Science, or something like that. I can't remember the exact title, but it's just an excellent book. He mentions talking to a friend of his who had talked to a NASA Nazi scientist who mentioned the fact that Hitler was trying to construct some sort of time machine in the Harz Mountains. And when pressed to give further details, the man clammed up. Mm. But I suspect that what the man was talking about was the bell, because again, we're dealing with this device with a torsion-based physics. In other words, the physics to manipulate space-time.
Right.
And the bell, incidentally, was headquartered, or the research was headquartered in and around Lower Silesia in Germany, which would border the Harz Mountains. And you can actually see some of these installations to this day in the former eastern zone of Germany, and now it's Poland. Interestingly enough, Igor Witkowski has also informed me that apparently a company has bought the site of these old installations and plans to move in and demolish them. Because they've had German researchers going in there taking radioactive measurements, and they're quite high, as a matter of fact, in some of these installations.
All right.
So, you know, to me it has the appearance that somebody's trying to hush up all physical evidence of this story as completely as they can. Because it certainly, I don't think they expected the story to get out so quickly after the German reunification.
All right, we have a caller on the line, and I'm pretty sure I know who this one is. So let's get them on here. So Alav, I am assuming it is you.
It is me.
Well, how are you tonight?
I'm all right. How are you?
Doing good, doing good. So you got some questions? We got about 10 minutes left, and I know you could take another 4 hours.
Probably. Well, actually, I did have one question, but I also wasn't sure if your guest was aware of some work that Ted Phillips was doing in that area, in the area of Lower Silesia and the Harz Mountains. He apparently had come across some information that I want to say it was a mining engineer who was fighting in World War II at the time, somehow came across a buried object, a metal object inside the Harz Mountains that had a hum and a strange glow, some of the things that some of these exotic.
No, I am not familiar with that, but I would ask you to email me after the show and share your information with me, because one of the things that I actually mention in Secrets of the Unified Field is the possibility that Kammler, when he took the project documentation out of Europe, may simply have left the device itself behind and left it there in the Harz region. So I'm extremely interested in finding out what you may know about this. So email me, go to my website, and click the contact button and email me. I'd be very interested in finding out more.
Sure, and one of obviously Ted is more of a UFO researcher, and he does a lot of trace case analysis. But apparently, back into medieval history, there are stories of objects descending from the sky in the Harz Mountains and actually drilling themselves into the earth. So he's approaching it more from a ufological point of view, but he supposedly knows approximately where the area is. He's narrowed it down. He's gone out there, I think, 3 or 4 times, and he thinks he knows where the cave is now. He's just trying to raise money to go out there one more time. So I'll definitely email you.
Yeah, email as much information as possible, because if that's true, then it makes the selection by the Nazis of that particular region to conduct this research even more interesting and intriguing. So I'm definitely interested in what you know or what he knows.
Well, some of the information that I kind of sussed out, because obviously, I'm a fan of your books, I guess you could say, and you're welcome. And I do have an interest in the topic in general, although I don't talk about it much because of its content. But apparently, the Anna Nerby did extensive research through that whole area, and they sent in teams throughout the Hartz Mountains looking for this stuff. And as early as 1939, the Hitler was sending in spelunking teams looking for these caves within the Hartz Mountains, which I guess there are quite a few caves in there. So he was actually sending in groups of spelunkers to try to locate these devices. So that, you know, the kind of connection I always made, and having read the Brotherhood of the Bell and the other books, is that maybe this is where the bell came from. Maybe this is where they got the torsion physics from. Maybe it's a little bit of a stretch, but
my whole problem with the whole crash and retrieval explanation for Nazi science is that you don't have to go there in order to see how they came to the conclusions they did.
Oh, I know.
You have a very clear theoretical and conceptual trail from some of the things that the German physicists are writing about, as well as a very clear conceptual trail within the esoteric societies, secret societies within Germany and within the Ahnenerbe itself. So I don't think you have to go there. However, you are correct in saying that Himmler did send many expeditions to explore the various caves in Europe, and especially in that region of Germany. So that is absolutely true.
But the other abiding interest that obviously it's a little distant from the Bell, but kind of in the same zone, is the Ahnenerbe. It's probably next to the Kammler group. It's probably one of the most well-guarded secrets of some of the things that they actually did. I mean, Ron's books, there are some hints at some of the things that they did, but there's never actually been a book written really about the Ahnenerbe, except for, the stuff about Hans Schiffer, which, I mean, that was kind of fringy for what the Ahnenerbe did. But
I can tell you that in The Philosopher's Stone, I get into some of the conceptual stew that is part of the thinking of the SS, and I do so in some detail because it's quite important to understand that context for the way that the Nazi physicists think. And I tried to prepare the ground for that book intentionally in Secrets of the Unified Field with that chapter that I called the Swastika Tensor. Because it's really kind of an ongoing story, and there is a definite connection between what's going on in the Ahnenerbe and other upper echelons of the SS and what's going on with their investigation of this kind of physics with the Bell. The long and short of it is that the Nazis had thrown out relativity itself as a basis for conceptualizing the development of physics. And in doing so in a peculiar way, they're actually following Einstein, because Einstein himself, in his unified field theory papers, is really throwing out some of the assumptions that he made in general relativity. So, he recognized the weaknesses of his own theory.